Picking up immediately where the first film left off, the Abbott family must now venture beyond the borders of their home in order to survive in an increasingly hostile world filled with death, destruction, potential Cloverfield connections, and noise. The first A Quiet Place movie, directed by Jim Halpert, is one of my favourite horror movies of all time, not just because of how original it was, but also because the script was great, I fell in love with the characters, it was scary as hell, and John Krasinski directed the shit out of it. So you can imagine how excited I was when they announced Krasinski would be coming back, this time without his co-writers Beck and Woods from the first film, to write and direct a follow-up, and finally, after years of anxious anticipation from myself and many others, and having to endure the disappointment of it being pushed back, thank you COVID, I finally got the chance to see this movie, and there is a lot to love about it. For one, I sure hope Krasinski is happy with his work here, because this movie is proficiently directed. Even though his character Lee from the first film doesn't play a substantially integral role in this film, his skill as a director and the masterful execution of, well, everything, is basically the star of the show. I mean, the movie was shot on 35mm film, and I think that was an incredibly wise decision because the colors in this movie pop in a way that they just wouldn't on digital. The world looks more vibrant and detailed, and everything on screen just has more texture and solidity. Don't get me wrong, I don't have a problem with digital cameras at all, but my days, this movie looks gorgeous. The movie is entirely tension focused. It's one of those movies that keeps on building up the suspense, and I've said this about a lot of movies, but the suspense gets to a point where you feel like it just can't build up any higher, but then it just keeps on going. The movie does an excellent job at utilizing the fear of sound, because like the first one, these characters are dealing with creatures that hunt you using sound, which makes every single second of this movie chill-inducing. A lot of the time where there is an extensive amount of movement in the scene, John Krasinski will insert close-ups of stuff like dripping water or even freaking paper, and it terrified me, because whenever a character was climbing over something or trying to squeeze through a tight hole in the metal fence, those close-ups just further emphasize that literally any sound could attract these creatures, so there's a constant foreboding sense of dread throughout the entire film. Despite part 2 being grander in scale than part 1, it never feels like you're watching a spectacle. The suspense is always at a high, as literally every scene is dense and close-packed, and Krasinski has his characters front and center the entire time, with the monster action taking place around them. The monsters are almost always framed in the background with the characters in the foreground, which was actually scarier than if it were the other way around, because the characters could be sitting down or taking a breather or even running in the foreground, and then in the background the monsters could be creeping up on them or chasing them down, and in doing this Krasinski creates a more intimate link between the audience and the characters because the characters are the focus. The audience experiences these things with the characters, which boosts the suspense. The film rarely cuts to huge epic shots of epic destruction, and while the film does have plenty of that, the characters are almost always the focus. The performances are spectacular. Emily Blunt was wonderful in this movie. Noah Jupe and Melissa Simmons are both awesome, but Simmons from a performance standpoint stole the entire show. Her character Regan was my favorite character from the first film, and once again she ended up being my personal favorite this time. She has a much more featured role than she did in the first film, and I loved every second she was on screen because this character's journey in this film, especially when coupled with the events of the first film, is riveting from start to finish, and I can honestly say the same for all the returning characters. Kylian Murphy was also a great addition to this movie. I was a little worried that he would just end up being a stand-in for Lee from the first film, but he was so much more, and they did some things with this character that I was not expecting, and it was really cool. Kylian Murphy naturally killed it in the performance department. The film's reliance on silent communication is one of the biggest reasons why the acting in both the first and second movies is so good. There is verbal dialogue, yes, but the actors have to convey a lot of emotions through body and sign language, as well as facial expressions, and all of them accomplish this task phenomenally. I honestly can't wait to get my hands on the Blu-ray for this movie because, as I said, this movie picks up right where part 1 left off, and watching A Quiet Place part 1 and 2 back to back is gonna be the best 3 hours of me pissing my pants in bladder decimating fear ever! The first film didn't need to open with day one, because by cutting to a much later point in the timeline of these events, you get characters that understand the world that they live in, and know the rules, so you get to see how these characters survive in a world like this. This film, on the other hand, opens with day one, so we actually get to see the mass hysteria that eventually led to the events of the first film, and it is intense. It's goosebumps inducing, and I jumped out of my seat a number of times during that sequence, as well as a bunch of other times during the movie. It might actually be one of my favorite opening scenes of all time. In terms of what I disliked about the film, actually, nothing. I loved every single frame of this movie. Obviously, due to the coronavirus pandemic, I haven't seen a movie in a cinema for a little while, and I am so glad that this movie was what welcomed me back into the cinemas. It was so good, not just because I was in the cinema again, but because I was watching an amazing film that I really want to watch again. I really hope Krasinski continues to make more movies like this, because A Quiet Place Part 1 and 2 together are legit the best suspense thrill ride I've seen in the past few years. I would genuinely rank them among movies like Alien and John Carpenter's The Thing. With all that said, A Quiet Place Part 2 gets a freaking 10 out of freaking 10. So that was my review of A Quiet Place Part 2. Thank you so much for watching as always. I do hope you enjoyed this video, but before I go, I would just like to ask you guys, what did you think of A Quiet Place Part 2? Did you think it was good? Did you think it was bad? Did you think it was somewhere in the middle? Please leave your thoughts down in the comments below. Until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you. Always.